Hello, my name is Joe Harned, and we are at Morris Family Shellfish Farms. We are at the hatchery located at Mill Point. I've been a part of this full-time for the past 5 years. My uncle started this operation about 30 years ago. He was a fifth-generation commercial fisherman, and around 1980, Skip Kemp came from NCC grant and introduced my uncle to clam farming and aquaculture. And from there, my uncle grew a little bit more every year and turned an old fish house, 80-year-old fish house, into a hatchery. Through storms and trials and tribulations over the years, he's kept growing and innovating, and multiple hurricanes have done some pretty catastrophic damage here, and that goes to show our resiliency in the industry as well. And that's part of aquaculture, is being able to pick yourself back up and get right back at it. We're here in the hatchery. We are in the broodstock and algae room, and behind me and around me, these carboys are made out of chicken wire, and at the moment they don't have any algae in them, but we grow our own algae here, which provides clean and a sterile known algae source, which is food. And there's a few Tetraselmis and Isochrysis, to name just two of the many different flavors we will have in here for clams and oysters. So the cow walls you see behind us are all clear. They've all got fresh seawater in them. And here in a few months, or in a few weeks rather, we've got algae. And the clams in front of me here are, again, our broodstock, and we have to constantly feed them. This is not a flow-through system, so we are constantly dosing and feeding these clams and oysters algae. And throughout their time here, getting conditioned in warmer water and fattening them up, we will be feeding them algae. This one is Tetraselmis, and there's a handful of others that most of them are green. There's some brown algae, there's some red algae. Different algae have different nutrient values to them. It'll be green, a green tinge to the water when he doses it, and it's pretty neat. It'll come back within a couple hours, and I think an oyster filters 50 gallons. One oyster will filter 50 gallons a day. So it won't take very long at all for a 200-gallon tank with a couple hundred clams or oysters in it. It'll be just a matter of hours, and you'll come back and there will be no food. So they're fat and happy. They've ate. Once the seed moves out of here to the platform into Upwellers, it's all flow through. So they start to eat algae that's naturally in the water. They're out there doing their own thing. We don't mess with them as far as feeding them algae goes once they leave this hatchery. So moving from the hatchery outside, and as we're progressing through the oyster's life cycle, these are what is known as an Upweller system, and these are itty bitty oysters. So this is the size they would come out of those tanks in the hatchery and come out here. And these are Upweller silos that look similar to this. And it has a real fine mesh micron size screen. And I think those are 500 micron screens. So this is a daily job of cleaning these off in the summertime when they're really feeding and spending a lot of energy and eating a lot and making a lot of waste. So as they get older, they're going to jump up in screen size. So again, as you just saw, these here are itty bitty, almost like sand grains. And within a couple weeks, when they're really growing in the summertime, we're going to step right down here to another Upweller. and they're going to start looking really start looking like an oyster. So that's the next size up, and I think it might be a 300 micron screen. And they're just going to keep stepping up, and we're out here shaking a sieve and washing them down. We'll drain these tanks all the way down. Water goes out through the boxes at the back and out back into the sound. So it's a recirculating system to an extent. More so, it's a flow-through system. But we pump raw seawater from the sound. Salinity, full-strength salt water is about 36 parts per thousand. And we have a pretty consistent salinity here that's around 30 to 32 parts per thousand. So we have a very salty oyster throughout its life cycle, which makes a really nice product. So we're going to step down 1 or 2 more tanks here, and we'll see a little bit bigger as we move down. So each one of those is a single juvenile oyster, either as seed or spat, oyster spat, or oyster seed. And from here is when we're going to progress and move on out to the farm. There were 2 leases behind us, each one about 4 acres apiece. We're going to go around the corner here, and we're in Nelson's Bay now, and going to the majority and the heart of our farm. So we're going to get back up on plane, and we'll catch you back in a second. We have made it to one of our main farms. We talked briefly earlier about gear, and now that we're actually on the farm, you can see what I mean by gear, oyster cages. And again, we have chosen the flip bag system. These are top floats. So the ones that you see the black floats sitting on top of the water, and then compared to the ones that you don't see the floats are on the bottom. When they're down, floats up on top, they're in the growing position, so they've got oysters in them. When they're flipped up, there's no oysters in them, and they're drying and defouling, and that's a constant issue out here of things growing on your cages, whether it be grass, barnacles, sponge. So these are our grow out bags. So there's a few benefits of floating gear. For us, ease of working from inshore to offshore. It typically doesn't get above our waders, which is key. Being able to work it at all tides. Another benefit of the floating gear is it promotes a deep cupped oyster from the get-go. And there's actually a formula for the perfect half shell oyster, and it's length, width, and cup. And there's a matrix that you can get it right on the head, but that is almost ideal. Real deep cup. It's going to have meat coming all the way out to the edge of the oyster. We also tumble, and the guys you see on the barge, two of my crew, Fish and J-Rod, and they're out here with me pretty much daily, and we will tumble, which sorts them into 3 different sizes. So we are constantly going through and sorting out the smallest and the biggest for market, and we have They're really strong, have been selling and working with inland seafood out of Charlotte for the past 20 years. So that is predominantly where our oysters will go to market, is to inland seafood. And from there they go all over the place, down south, Atlanta, Florida sometimes, a little far up north. We also have 2 restaurants in Charlotte that carry our oysters as their house oyster, Sea Level and the Waterman. So these guys are doing performing the art of culling, which takes a while to get your eyeball trained for exactly the prettiest stuff. I do not recommend this for the ones of you at home. A quick shucking instruction from the man on the farm. Find that hinge, give it a little bit of a wiggle, and a quarter turn pops him open. They've got an abductor muscle that you have to cut at the top. Clean away any excess shell and cut him away from the bottom, and it's ready to eat. We like to just take them down the hatch. I'll fire this tumbler up real quick and let y'all see that briefly and the process of that. And that again is to chip away that most recent growth on that lip of the oyster, which is promoting the oyster to stop, promotes the oyster to put down cup and put the shell down versus out. What we're looking at here is what we call putbacks. So these are all oysters that did not make the cut or did not make the grade. They're too small. We won't spend our time sorting through them. These will go back. So the cool thing, like I said, that head of lettuce, you pick it, it's got to go. These guys, they're not ready yet. That's all good. They're gonna go back into the water and continue growing. So I'm gonna fire this generator up, and we're gonna throw some down the tumbler, roll some down the tumbler, and it drops in two different grades through the middle, and then out the end are the biggest ones that are typically the best, and they're ready to harvest. So out of the first drop will usually be the smallest. Typically when we're grading bigger oysters, it will be the shell that drops out first. Dead shell, maybe from crabs, maybe they just didn't make it, wasn't ideal. So from once they come out the end of the tumbler, these guys have been up here grading and making the final touches of you know, if it's going to be truly quality enough to go to market or not. And from here, we usually put them in baskets, and during the summertime, we'll put them back overboard until the end of the day. The old wives' tale of only eating oysters in months that end in R is truly that. It's a wives' tale that was brought on years back, many moons ago, due to lack of refrigeration, mechanical refrigeration. So there's about 15 to 20 acres of bottom that we're leasing here. There's 2 different leases. There's a bottom lease, which you have to obtain before you get a water column lease. And a bottom lease, you can grow clams or oysters, anything up to 18 inches off the bottom. Anything above that 18-inch mark has to be water column lease. So you're essentially leasing the whole column of water. By law and per the state, this is public trust water. We technically do not own the bottom, or we don't own the water either. Majority of the time, if you had questions while you're out on the boat or out on your kayak, the farmer will love to talk to you and shed some knowledge on what they're doing and what they've got going on. You know, by the time these oysters hit the door and come to you, the consumer, whether it be at the restaurant or taking them home to eat, you know, they've been touched quite a few times. There's hardly ever a time where you set it out here and you don't ever touch it again. It's a beautiful place, and we talk about it quite a bit. These guys really enjoy what they're doing as well. Even on the nasty days, I don't know there's any place I'd rather be than being out here.
I'm Eric Herbst. I'm the Coastal Aquaculture Specialist with North Carolina Sea Grant. We provide research, education, outreach opportunities relating to current issues that are affecting the North Carolina coast. So as Joe mentioned earlier, North Carolina Sea Grant was really instrumental in transferring the technology required to allow Jimmy Morris to transition from being a commercial fisherman to being a full-time shellfish farmer over the course of about 10 years or so. The people here are fantastic. I mean, hardworking, resilient folks. They're able to overcome any challenge life throws at them. Shellfish farming is hard, and it's grown tremendously over the last 10 years here in North Carolina, especially the half-shell market. So the number of water column leases in 2012, I believe, was only about 8 leases total for a total of perhaps 25 acres, something like that. In the beginning of 2020, the number of leases went up all the way to as high as 84, I believe, with over 400 acres of water column leases. And that's really feeding or supplying the half-shell market. One of the programs that North Carolina Sea Grant received funding for was the development of the Shellfish Farming Academy, and it's been a huge success. I think multiple students are in the process of applying for leases and starting their aquaculture operations. We've had students that are already in the industry, wanted to learn more and use that knowledge to expand their operations. With the rapid growth of shellfish mariculture in the state, it was pretty clear that we needed a trained workforce. One of the challenges many growers face is that they might get shut down after rain events due to the possibility of bacterial contamination. So what Dr. Nelson and Dr. Saia have done is created an app that takes big data and weather forecasts to really come up with a probability of closure over the next 24, 48, or 72 hours. That's a technology that was developed at NC State University, and it's being transferred to the industry here shortly, which is fantastic.
I'm a marine ecologist, but I really enjoy working on applied projects. Work that interests me is work that can be done to investigate either a species or a subject matter, see what we can learn and see how we can make changes, apply it, and see if we made a difference, improved it in some way. So for many years I actually lived abroad and worked in Australia on the Great Barrier Reef, spent 5 years living in Fiji doing research out there, and my wife and I were ready to move home and take some of our work and focus it from where we grew up and see if we couldn't, do some good there. So an oyster is a bivalve, and it gets that terminology because of the two different shells that come together to make up the oyster. And it's held together by a strong abductor muscle that you've got to pry apart and to get to the meat to eat it as a lover of oysters. They're an animal, but they also create a reef, a structure, hard bottom, a habitat. And because of that, they serve a lot of very important roles. Ecologically, they protect shoreline, they stabilize it, which is very important for people living in the coastal regions. We get hurricanes here. Second most impacted state on the East Coast behind Florida. So they help buffer from large storms, nor'easters as well. They reduce erosion. They're also excellent filters, so they clean up the water, improve water quality. And they serve as reefs, as important nursery habitats for other species. The Nature Conservancy was very interested in filling a lot of these gaps that we have about the North Carolina oyster fishery and seeing if we can't build towards a future stock assessment model. And a key part of that was forming a well-rounded committee So involving the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries, both the fishery side and the habitat side, because oysters are unique in the fact that they're a fishery, but they're also a habitat. And then finally, who better to involve than experts in oysters, commercial fishermen. And Keith was interested in helping and improving the fishery and seeing how we can do things better. And he's been a part of this project since day one, and we're very excited to have him.
I'm Keith Bruno. I own and run Endurance Seafood in Oriental, North Carolina. I'm a commercial fisherman as well as a wholesaler. I love oystering. Oystering is really, it's laborious work, it's hard work. We start probably 5 o'clock in the morning. It's a long ride downriver in the dark, in the cold. You know, the oysters don't move, they're there, but you still have to figure out what the best part of the reef is, where other oystermen have been, what's been worked, what hasn't been worked. So it's kind of like a big chess game to actually put the oysters in the boat and in the bags. I was first approached for this project by Brian Boynton from the Nature Conservancy. He came, he sat on the dock, he was very pleasant. He said, I'll come back next week, we'll talk some more. He came back next week and he started talking about this project. We set up this group of people, many who I knew and respected as being knowledgeable and not being commercial hating people. And I said, yeah, I'd like to be part of this project. And at the first meeting, I met Dan, and Dan was very quiet, kind of sat in the background, didn't say much. But it wasn't long before I realized that Dan was the real key figure in this entire project.
It didn't take long before myself saw the value of involving the commercial fishermen. You know, we were sitting there trying to build a methodology, and you know, scientists, we're not experts at using the gear. So the next logical step for me was to extend the methodology to include experts of the gear, like Keith, to be involved as captains in the process of sampling. And I think from there, it just kind of all fell into place.
There are various ways to harvest oysters. My preference is the dredge. It's a kind of a big rake with teeth on the bottom, weighs 100 pounds. There's a catch bag on the back where the oysters kind of funnel into as you drag the rake along the bottom. A good oysterman knows how much scope to put out and how much depth of water and which part of the reef. There's a lot that plays into if I caught 20 oysters per drag or 50 oysters per drag. And of course, the more you put in the bag of good oysters, the faster you get to go home. I saw this project as a way to kind of make things more uniform and get a process in place where the fishermen could kind of get behind what was going on and not just relying on what the state was using.
Right now, what we're in the process of doing and have been doing for 2 years is to take our known areas of reef, to go out there with scuba gear and to dive down there and take samples. And by taking enough samples on scuba gear, we get a pretty confident estimate of what's actually there. And for that, we turned to the committee, to the commercial oystermen, to find something that they recommended. And we ended up on dredge gear as the next piece of the puzzle. So then we go out and we sample the same reefs that we've dived with dredge gear, and we look to see how what we know is there shows to what we're sampling with the gear, and we can kind of correct for that and then apply that dredge sample methodology across larger areas.
I have to hunt and search to see where Mother Nature has left the spat and what's growing and what's not growing. And it's just a kind of a library of places that you build up in your mind over the years that, you know, oh, let me go check that reef we were at, 2 years ago. Let's see if anything's grown there. You lift up that first dredge and the anticipation is wonderful. Oh boy, let's see. And you feel the wire and you say, man, I think we got something here. There's something here. There's something. And it comes up and it could be all shell, all dead oysters, all nothing. Or it could be, oh yeah, we're on them. We got them. Let's make a circle. Let's get a marker down and work these and get out of here before somebody sees us here. Dan knows what's on the bottom by diving, and picking up oysters. Then I can come back the following week and go over that area with the oyster dredge and be able to say, well, if Dan says there's 15 oysters per square meter right here, and we've towed X number of square meters and I got close to the same, well then my dredge is showing pretty much what he knows as being fact. And open and close areas on fact, not, well, we think that we should close it because there's X number. The state and the fishermen have to work together going forward. To be on opposite ends of the ecological spectrum doesn't help anybody. There are people, oh, you can't possibly drag a 100-pound toothed bar over a reef and expect anything to live, when that maybe not really be the case. You know, we're working on real-time numbers and real fact as to whether it's what the actual collateral damage of a dredge is. There are a lot of other factors that harm the population a lot more than that oyster dredge. We're on the water every day. We have an idea of what's real and what's there, but as a whole, the group cannot discount the science and what they know is going to be there. We need to use smart, science-backed facts going forward. And a relationship like what me and Dan have, I think that's what's going to come out of this, is smart, science-backed fact, and then be able to formulate a plan for conservation.
I mean, if it wasn't for NGOs like the Nature Conservancy, this project would have never been started. It would have never got funding. If it wasn't for North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries being open to input and willing to sort of host and support a program like this, we wouldn't be where we are today. And if it wasn't for other academic partners, you know, coming together and working collaboratively with people like Keith and other oystermen and fishermen, we wouldn't continue to make progress on very challenging real world problems.
I think this is rare, that so many different people have come together to try and figure this big giant problem out. There was no faith in the division's numbers from the oystermen. Hopefully we can get a proven, solid method that people can trust, you know, and therein is the big word, a method that people can trust. Hopefully we'll get that all hashed out with this project.
Now that these videos have concluded, I want to remind everyone to remain muted. And if you have any questions for our presenters, we have a PhD student from NC State, Daniel Bowling, with us, who you saw in the video. And then we also have Eric Herbst, who's here from NC Sea Grant. And they're here to talk to you a little bit more about what they've got going on, and hopefully answer a few of your questions. So if you have any questions for our presenters today, go ahead and drop those in the chat for us. Where are the NC oysters sold? Restaurants, domestic markets, international?
Hey, this is Eric Herbst. I think I can speak to the aquacultured oysters here, or maricultured oysters here in North Carolina, and they definitely are sold locally, within the state and regionally, and even across the country, with direct sales, shipping out to Florida, Texas, even the West Coast. To my knowledge, they're not sold internationally at this stage. I may be mistaken, but I know there are efforts to improve international commerce and trade of shellfish with the European Union, for example. And I think there are a couple of states, just 2 states that I'm aware of, that are able to sell to the European Union at this stage. But North Carolina Shellfish Growers Association, East Coast Shellfish Growers Association, they are working toward getting North Carolina approved and being part of that international agreement with the European Union to sell oysters over there, or North Carolina oysters over there.
got a question from Carrie Conley. She said, I've been researching into sustainable seafood, like how everyone wants to eat local meat and so forth. Sounds like this is super sustainable for the environment. How can we check to make sure we're buying North Carolina oysters and sustainably farmed oysters?
Sure, I can take this one. And Eric, feel free to add to my response as you'd like as well. But the easiest way to do is ask the market where they actually purchased the oysters from. They should know with the oyster tags where they actually were purchased from, whether they're coming from a farm themselves or if they were actually wild caught and landed by local oystermen. It's not uncommon to go to the fish market and see that oysters come from lots of different areas, including Virginia, even the Gulf, Florida. So if you want to support your local oystermen and local growers, it's worth asking and worth trying to get them sourced here in North Carolina.
All right, we got a question from Tyler saying, not including leases or seed, what would you say are the biggest limiting factors for people wanting to get into oyster farming?
That's a really good question. I know there are it depends on the person or company wanting to enter the industry. But I think one of the limitations are the regulatory requirements and user conflicts for public trust waters. So if you want to get into the oyster industry in North Carolina and you're in a rural part of the state, it's going to be easier to get a lease approved than it is in the higher population centers along the coast, such as down near Wilmington and the Brunswick, Brunswick County area. So I think that can be challenging depending on where you want to start your farm. If there's a lot of interests in those public trust waters that might conflict with a commercial operation, that's definitely going to be challenging. Site selection is really important. Got to give a shout out to Division of Marine Fisheries, North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries. They've developed a tool that complements the tool developed by UNC Wilmington. Both tools are available to help growers find the best sites that have the highest chance or highest probability of being approved. And there are free tools available online. And that really goes a long way to help with that issue of choosing an appropriate site. So I think those are the challenges. The economic challenges, it depends again on the person applying. But I think the cost to apply for a lease, a bottom lease, is around $300, and then an additional $100 or so for a water column amendment. So the financial cost to apply for a lease isn't all that high, but there is a substantial amount of capital investment that goes into starting an aquaculture, shellfish mariculture business, and your cash flow, takes some time to kick in. So that's one of the challenges, the financial side of it. You have a fairly substantial capital investment going in, and you're not going to receive cash flow until you harvest your first crop, which can be, as long as 18 months or so. So that's another challenge when getting into the business.
Excellent. So the next question we got, Daniel, you might be able to answer this one. When you're dredging, do you pick up things that are not oysters, other species and whatnot? And what do you do with them once you get them up on the boat?
Absolutely. And the commercial men are very used to this. They do a lot of dredging during the day just to get their 10 or 15 bushels of oysters that they're allowed to get. But along with it comes, blue crabs. Every now and then you'll get some fish in the dredge as well, like flounder, croaker. And because there's a lot of military training around the coastline, it's not uncommon to pick up some old ammunition and things like that too. That sort of stuff's removed and not deposited back. But your other fish and bycatch is, along with a lot of other oysters, comes a lot of shell and a lot of small juveniles, And that's part of what we're studying with this project as well, to see, how many oysters actually have to be put on the culling table before, a fisherman's able to get his limit for the day.
Excellent. And a bit of a follow-up on dredging. What are some of the side effects of dredging? How is this impacting? What are you guys finding in your studies?
Great question. Well, we're still early in that proponent of the project, but we've got one short-term data series back to show any sort of impact from looking, say, a few weeks after oysters have been dredged and then put back into the environment. And initial results seem to show that if the damage is light, then they will likely recover. But with that said, we still need to wait until March before we can really say anything definite. So fingers crossed, for the dredgers and oystermen that, things go well, and we'll wait to see.
Ryan has a question. He says, what resources beyond the digital tools are available for those picking sites? Is there an agency to check with before submission?
Aside from the tools available, you can always contact us here at North Carolina Sea Grant. That's part of the extension services that we provide. So myself and our mariculture associate, Brian Snyder, are able to help prospective mariculturists interested in shellfish farming here in North Carolina go through the different tools that are available online, but then also help them advise them on the important aspects of doing your research and being in compliance with the other requirements, such as 300 feet from a navigable waterway, 100 feet from a developed shoreline. Can't choose any sites with submerged aquatic vegetation or natural shellfish beds, etc. So that's something that we at North Carolina Sea Grant Extension are happy to help with.
Excellent. All right, we've gotten a few questions come in about growth of oysters and how long can oysters live below 10 ppt of salinity, and how long can they live beyond both temperature extremes?
I can speak for a little bit of the wild population. It depends on a number of factors. One being how long they've had to store up energy for, and if they have a very intact shell that allows them to completely close and seal themselves off. To give everyone an idea, 10 parts per thousand, that's about a third the strength of seawater. So it is low, but that's still within their habitable range. If you were to, remove them from the water and they were to stay out, the key is that they don't dry out. If they can stay sealed off, then they will be able to remain for several weeks. And even in other parts of the country, say up north, they'll slow their metabolism down and even go dormant, and they'll stay that way for 3 or so months before the water temperature warms up, and they're able to start filtering again and building up those food reserves and prepare for spawning in the summer.
And I think we got to see a bit of this on one of the videos, but how long does it take for oysters growing from seeds to market?
So highly variable. A lot of biology is highly variable, but here in North Carolina, in a temperate climate with a relatively long growing season compared to the northern states, the Northeast and Pacific Northwest, I believe many of the farmers here are able to reach market size, which would be, a minimum of 2 inches to 3 inches for the half shell market, within about 12 months after outplanting the seed into their cages, give or take a couple months, depending on that particular year and the temperatures during the growing seasons. But I would say that's about average for North Carolina.
What can we do as alumni and friends to help bolster the oyster industry in North Carolina?
Great question. I think the first thing, in my opinion, is to continue to support the industry. Buy local if you can. And then moving past that, try to recycle the oyster shells after you've consumed them, and see if you can get local restaurants near you to do the same. For the wild stock, one of the biggest limiting factors is available hard bottom. And there's many NGO programs out there, and even DMF over the years, they had a very thriving culch replanting program that has slowed down due to funding in recent years. But getting that culch back to the ecosystem where it came from increases the wild stock population over time. So those are two quick things. And then the third that I'll give you is just continue to support your resource managers and the departments. Pay attention to legislation and support bills that are coming through to help these growers and fishermen that are trying to make a living in these areas.
Great. And Kathy asked, what impacts do you anticipate from global warming? Either one.
That's a really good question. I think as water temperatures warm, one of the things would be potentially a benefit would be a shorter growing season potentially here for oyster farmers in North Carolina, where they could get to market that much quicker. Other than that, I think that there are some potential challenges to deal with. We don't necessarily have to deal with ocean acidification as much as some of the northern latitudes, but that's definitely a concern and something to keep an eye on. I think sea level rise associated with global warming, will have an effect on our coastal ecosystems and our estuaries, and that may have an effect on the siting and possible locations for shellfish farms in the future. Whether it's an improvement or a reduction in available sites, I think is yet to be seen, but that's definitely a possible effect of global warming as well.
And then one more question. We are actually, I'm afraid we're going to run out of time. Thank you all for submitting your questions and joining us this evening. Thank you to Daniel Bowling and Eric Herbst for coming on and sharing a bit of their knowledge and taking us on the road all about Eastern North Carolina, showing us the ins and the outs. Thank you all for joining us. A friendly reminder that all of these will be recorded and emailed back out to everyone following the conclusion of this program. I believe that we are about to conclude at 7:15. So thank you all. And as always, go Pack.
Go Pack. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Awoo!